Hello and welcome back to another lecture. Today we talk about levels of abstraction. So basically there are three levels of abstraction that we're going to talk about today. The basic form is called the utterance, a more abstract form is called the sentence, and then even more abstract form is called a proposition. So an utterance is less abstract or concrete. It's something physical. As we move up, we get something more abstract. So this is something you cannot hear. Now, why is it important to talk about the levels of abstraction? Well, we discussed that in working out a theory of semantics, one aspect is first pinpointing which parts of semantic analysis you want to deal with. Are we looking at semantics on the utterance level, or on the sentence level, or on the proposition level? And out of all these levels, which one is more important to meaning? Which one carries universal meaning? Which one carries more locally bound meaning or speaker bound meaning? Are there any differences between them? This will be our topic for today's lesson. So let's start by identifying each one of these three levels of abstraction one by one, and then we can look at some main differences between them. So the first one we're going to start with is the utterance. Okay. Now an utterance really is just any act of uttering that speakers perform. So uttering basically means that you're saying something. Now it is of convention that we indicate an utterance by using two quotation marks, single quotation marks. So in this example, I like apples between two single quotation marks indicates to me that this is an utterance uttered by some speaker. It's not a sentence, which would be written in italics. And the reason is because there's a difference between uttering a sentence and the actual sentence. So for example, if someone says, I like apples, and then again, another time they say, I like apples, and then a third time they say, I like apples. The result here is three utterances on the part of the speaker, because that speaker had uttered I like apples three different times on three different occasions. But if you notice, they're all the same sentence, so it's only one sentence. So this is one sentence uttered three times. So that's just a simple example of why we need conventions like the single quotation marks or the italics to distinguish between if something was an utterance or a sentence. Now back to our utterance. The following are all examples of utterances. Ouch, my dog. Yeah, I hate apples. This is very interesting. So if you notice, all of these are what we just call utterances, but they are not all of equal length. So in this one, we actually have an entire sentence here as well. But in the first three, they are not complete ideas, they are not complete sentences. But regardless, they are still considered to be utterances. However, the following word is not an utterance, because it's not a word. It's not from the language that we speak. Now, it could be from another language, a language we do not speak, and still be considered an utterance as long as it is part of language, any language. So this is not part of any language, and so it is not an utterance. But this is. It is used in English, and so that is an utterance. So now let's look at some of the basic characteristics of utterances. As we just discussed, all these different sizes of utterances are still considered to be utterances. Believe it or not, an entire paragraph may also be considered an utterance, but under special circumstances. For example, it has to be uttered all at once, with no pauses, because after an utterance is silence. So think of it as taking turns when we speak. If it's one person's turn to speak, the entire stretch of their speech, so long as there are not any major pauses, will be considered an utterance. So what are the major characteristics of utterances? Number one, they need not be grammatical. For example, ouch. is not a full sentence, does not contain a full idea. There really is not much grammar involved here. The second thing is that it needs to be uttered by one person at a specific time, location, and event. Like we said before, it can be any piece of language so far as it is a piece of a language and not just some gibberish. So these are some of the basic characteristics of utterances. Let's take a look at what a sentence is like next. Now I'm sure all of you know what a sentence is. Like we said, the conventions we're going to use for sentences is to write them in italics so as to distinguish a sentence from an utterance. Now recall the example where one sentence, "I like apples," was uttered 3 different times by the same person. So why did we consider it to be one sentence? Well, because they all contain the same grammatical information. They're all really just the same sentence. Now, one major difference between a sentence and an utterance is that a sentence takes into consideration the grammar. So if I say something like, "Is what it?" Is this an utterance? Yes. Is it a sentence? No, it is not a sentence. And that's because it is not grammatical. So a sentence takes into consideration the grammatical aspect. So if we go back to our levels of abstraction, an utterance is a non-abstract physical event. Going up the scale of abstractness is the part where we care about grammar. Now let's see the third part. The third part is called the propositions. This is the most abstract level that we will deal with here. So if you recall, just like one sentence was uttered 3 different times, and so the result was 3 different utterances of one and the same sentence. Likewise, in this case, we can have 2 different sentences, 3 different sentences, all summing up to the same exact proposition. Let's take an example. If I have a sentence, "John ate the apple," and another sentence, "The apple was eaten by John." How many sentences do I have here? That's 1 and that's 2. First of all, why did I consider these 2 different sentences? Well, recall that a sentence has at its central core grammatical facts. Now, since the grammar of this sentence is different from the grammar of the second sentence, one being active and the other being passive voice, then they are considered 2 sentences. Well, here's the million-dollar question. Both of these sentences still say the same thing. They both have essentially the same idea behind them. They both want to convey to us the same exact message. And that message is that there's an apple, and there's a person named John, and there's an event of eating. John was the person who performed the action of eating, and the apple was the object upon which the action takes place. So that is the essential idea that we find in both of these sentences. Oh, and not only that, you can also change the language. Like, take Arabic for example. Akala John al-tufaha. So this is basically ate John the apple. Is this another sentence? Yes, it is. Why? Because the grammatical structure changed. And why did the grammatical structure change? Well, because we have another language, and this other language has its own grammatical rules. So now we have 3 different sentences, all saying essentially the same thing. Now we can translate what they say into a proposition. The proposition will take the form of the action, and then we want to ask about the agent of the action, and then we want to ask about the theme or patient of that action, okay, or the object affected by the action. So that would end up looking like this. Eat, agent is John, as we see here, and then the thing affected by it is the apple, and here at-tufaha, which also means the apple. So that is basically the proposition or the essential core meaning behind all these 3 sentences. What are propositions used for in daily life? Well, think of a translator. A translator might want to translate the Arabic sentence أكل جون التفاحة into English. The translator first converts this Arabic sentence into a proposition in his mind. They end up with eat John the apple. Then from this proposition, they apply the grammatical rules of English and create the sentence John ate the apple, which abides by the grammatical rules of English. Now you might notice a few things about this proposition here. Number one, in the sentence John ate the apple, the tense of the action or the verb was past tense, but that is not reflected here. Also, in the Arabic sentence, أكل جون التفاحة, the verb is also in past tense, and not only that, it's in Arabic. أكل, not eat or ate. So why did we end up creating a proposition where the action does not take into consideration grammatical information, and it does not take into consideration for the language being used? So if propositions are the essential core meaning of sentences regardless of the language being used, then definitely their function would be to provide the core, essential, universally understood meaning, and therefore it would not make any sense for them to be tied to any one language in particular. So the reason we use English here is only by convention. We could have easily used Arabic instead or French instead of that. That is exactly why we use all capital letters in this proposition to indicate that we do not mean the word eat in English, but the concept of eat as it is universally understood. We also do not care about the grammatical information here, and that's why we are at the highest level of abstraction. We are abstracting away from grammatical information here. We don't care about grammatical information because what we care about here is the essential core meaning that all these sentences share regardless of the language. Switching to any language or switching to active or passive voice will change the grammar, but the meaning of all of them will stay the same. This is why we do not care about grammatical information for propositions. Hope that's clear. Thanks for watching.